May 1944. A freight train rolled slowly through the Pennsylvania countryside, carrying men who had once marched under the swastika. Inside the wooden cars, German prisoners of war sat in silence, their gray uniforms wrinkled and stained with the dust of defeat. Some were Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia. Others had surrendered in Normandy, their units shattered by the weight of Allied bombardment. They stared through the slats at a landscape none of them had imagined. Endless farmland stretched toward distant horizons. Barns stood tall and red against green fields. Cattle grazed peacefully. Towns passed with church steeples and paved streets. Not a single crater, not one burned-out building, not a trace of war. One young unteroffizier pressed his face against the wood, his breath catching. He had been told America was on the brink of collapse, that its people were starving, that its factories were rubble. But here, in the heartland of the enemy, everything was whole, everything was thriving, and somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, lay the factories that would break him. The war had turned against Germany long before most of its soldiers realized it. In the deserts of North Africa, in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front, in the hedgerows of France, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht troops found themselves cut off, surrounded, and forced to raise their hands. By mid-1943, the flow of German prisoners into Allied custody had become a flood. Operation Torch had netted tens of thousands in Tunisia. The fall of Sicily brought more. The invasion of Italy, then France, delivered entire divisions into captivity. These men arrived at POW camps across Britain, North Africa, and increasingly the continental United States, carrying with them the worldview shaped by years of Nazi propaganda. They had been taught that America was a mongrel nation, weakened by democracy and racial diversity, incapable of producing the weapons or summoning the will to fight a modern war. Dr. Joseph Goebbels had told them America's factories were staffed by lazy workers more interested in jazz music and Hollywood films than in building tanks. German newsreels showed breadlines from the Great Depression, riots in American cities, and claimed the United States was teetering on the edge of social collapse. For many German soldiers, especially those who had never left Europe, this propaganda formed their entire understanding of the enemy. They believed Germany's industrial might, proven in the Blitzkrieg campaigns that had crushed Poland, France, and nearly the Soviet Union, was unmatched. The Ruhr Valley steel mills, the factories of the Rhine, the precision engineering of Munich and Berlin, these were the pillars of German confidence. Even as Allied bombs began to fall on German cities, even as supply lines stretched and fuel ran short, many soldiers clung to the belief that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 governed the treatment of prisoners of war, and the United States, unlike the Soviet Union, adhered strictly to its provisions. German POWs were to be housed, fed, and protected. They could not be tortured or executed. They were to receive mail, medical care, and adequate rations. American camps, hastily constructed across the country from Arizona to New York, from Texas to Michigan, became temporary homes for hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. But the Americans had another strategy in mind, one not explicitly outlined in any treaty. They would not break these men with cruelty. They would break them with truth. Early in the war, American intelligence officers noticed something during interrogations. German prisoners, particularly officers and NCOs, often expressed disbelief when told about American production figures. When informed that the United States was building a bomber every hour, a Liberty ship every day, they laughed. When shown photographs of assembly lines stretching the length of football fields, they assumed the images were propaganda. Their worldview could not accommodate the reality of American industrial power because they had been systematically lied to for years. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff recognized an opportunity. If German prisoners could be shown, not told, but shown, the true scale of American production, it might shatter their belief in German victory. More importantly, if these men eventually returned to Germany through prisoner exchanges or after the war, they would carry that knowledge with them. They would become witnesses to a truth the Nazi regime could not suppress. By 1943, the United States had transformed itself into what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan alone built over 8,000 B-24 Liberator bombers. The sprawling complex, designed by Albert Kahn, featured an assembly line over a mile long. At peak production, a completed 4-engine heavy bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. Shipyards from California to Maine launched vessels at a pace that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. Liberty ships, the 441-foot cargo vessels designed to replace tonnage lost to U-boat attacks, were being built in an average of 42 days. The record was set by the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours. By war's end, American shipyards had produced over 2,700 Liberty ships, 400 Victory ships, and hundreds of warships, ranging from destroyers to aircraft carriers. Tank production followed a similar trajectory. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, built over 22,000 M4 Sherman tanks. The Fisher Body Plant in Grand Blanc produced thousands more. These were not crude, hastily assembled vehicles. They were mechanically reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed German panzer units through sheer volume. For every German Tiger tank, expensive, complex, and produced in limited numbers, dozens of Shermans rolled off American assembly lines. German intelligence had utterly failed to grasp this reality. Hitler himself dismissed American industrial capacity as exaggerated. In meetings with his generals, he insisted that the United States lacked the organizational skill and work ethic to sustain mass production. He pointed to America's lack of a military tradition, its reliance on immigrant labor, its supposed cultural decadence. Even as German cities burned under the weight of American bombs, even as U-boats reported increasing losses to American escort carriers and destroyers, the Nazi leadership refused to accept what their own intelligence reports were telling them. Part of this failure stemmed from ideological blindness. Nazi racial theory insisted that a multi-ethnic democratic society could not compete with the disciplined, racially pure German state. Part of it came from geographic ignorance. Germany had been bombed repeatedly since 1942. Its factories operated under constant threat of air attack. Roads and railways were cratered. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, was pounded relentlessly by the RAF and USAF. German industrial production peaked in 1944 despite these attacks, a testament to the efforts of Albert Speer and German workers, but it could never match the output of a nation whose homeland remained untouched by enemy action. The decision to bring German POWs to America and show them this untouched industrial landscape was both strategic and psychological. It began informally, with prisoners being transported through American cities and inadvertently glimpsing the factories, the traffic, the abundance. Guards noticed their reactions, the silence, the pale faces, the muttered conversations in German that translators later reported as expressions of shock and despair. American commanders decided to formalize the process. Selected groups of German officers and NCOs, men whose testimony would carry weight among their fellow prisoners and, potentially, among German troops if they were ever repatriated, were taken on carefully orchestrated tours. They were shown automobile factories converted to aircraft production. They were walked through shipyards where welders worked around the clock under floodlights. They stood at the edge of steel mills where molten metal poured into molds that would become tank armor, ship hulls, and artillery barrels. The goal was not cruelty. It was psychological warfare of the most potent kind. These men would see with their own eyes that everything they had been told was a lie. They would understand that Germany was not fighting a peer adversary. It was fighting an industrial colossus that could absorb losses, replace equipment, and keep fighting long after Germany's factories fell silent. The human response to this revelation was profound and, for many prisoners, devastating. In memoirs written after the war, German POWs described the moment they first understood the scale of American production. One former Oberleutnant, captured in France and brought to a camp in Michigan, recalled being driven past the River Rouge complex, Ford's massive industrial facility in Dearborn. He had expected to see a single factory. Instead, he saw an entire city of steel and smoke, stretching for miles along the Detroit River. "I could not speak," he wrote years later. "I had fought in France. I had seen our panzers cut through enemy lines. I believed we were the strongest nation on earth. But this was beyond comprehension. One factory complex, larger than some German cities, producing trucks and jeeps and engines without end. And this was only one. There were hundreds like it across America." Another prisoner, a decorated tank commander from the Africa Corps, described standing inside the Willow Run bomber plant. He watched as workers, men and women, black and white, young and old, assembled B-24s with an efficiency that shocked him. In Germany, we were told American workers were lazy, that they did not have the discipline for war production. But these people moved with purpose. The assembly line never stopped. I saw a bomber's fuselage joined to its wings in minutes. I saw engines installed as if they were parts of a clock. And at the end of the line, a complete aircraft ready to bomb my homeland. I realized then that we had been lied to about everything. The propaganda collapse was total. For years, these men had been fed a steady diet of Nazi talking points. America was weak. America was divided. America could not fight. But standing in the middle of an American factory, surrounded by the noise of riveters and welders, watching tanks roll off assembly lines, the lies evaporated. Some prisoners wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. A few became angry, not at their American captors, but at their own leaders who had sent them to fight an unwinnable war. The industrial comparison was stark and undeniable. Germany's factories, even at their peak, could not match American output. The Ruhr Valley produced vast amounts of steel, but it was under constant bombardment. German tank production, while impressive, peaked at around 25,000 armored vehicles for the entire war. The United States produced over 88,000 tanks, and that was only part of its armored vehicle output. When half-tracks, armored cars, and self-propelled guns were included, the numbers became even more lopsided. German aircraft production told a similar story. Despite heroic efforts by workers and engineers, despite the dispersal of factories into forests and underground facilities, Germany produced roughly 120,000 military aircraft during the war. The United States produced nearly 300,000. And American planes were not just more numerous, they were often better equipped, with advanced radios, radar, and long-range fuel tanks that German designers could only dream of incorporating. The Americans used these factory tours as a deliberate psychological weapon, and they were devastatingly effective. Psychological operations, or PSYOPs, had been used in warfare for centuries, but the industrial tour represented something new, a weapon of truth. Prisoners were not being brainwashed or tortured into false confessions. They were being shown objective reality and allowed to draw their own conclusions. American intelligence officers carefully selected which prisoners would see which facilities. High-ranking officers, especially those from elite units like the Waffen-SS or Panzer divisions, were given priority. These men were true believers, ideologically committed to Nazism and confident in German superiority. Breaking their faith in the Reich's propaganda required overwhelming evidence, and the factories provided it. Reports from camp commanders noted significant changes in prisoner behavior after these tours. Men who had been defiant, who had sung Nazi songs and maintained military discipline in the camps, became quiet and withdrawn. Some began cooperating with interrogators, providing information about German troop movements, equipment, and morale. Others wrote letters, monitored by censors, expressing doubt and despair to fellow prisoners in other camps. German officers in particular experienced a moral and intellectual crisis. Many of these men were professional soldiers, graduates of military academies, trained in strategy and logistics. They understood what industrial capacity meant in modern warfare. They had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, the logistics of the Franco-Prussian War, the lessons of World War I. They knew that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in factories, mines, and shipyards. One Hauptmann, a staff officer captured in Normandy, spoke with an American interrogator after touring a tank factory. His words were recorded in a declassified Army intelligence report. "I believed our generals when they said American equipment was inferior. I believed our propaganda when it said American society was collapsing. But I have seen your factories. I have seen your workers. I have seen your cities untouched by bombs. We cannot win this war. We never could. Every tank we destroy, you build 10 more. Every plane we shoot down, you replace in a day. How do you defeat an enemy like that? You don't. You surrender and hope they are merciful." The moral reckoning that followed was perhaps the most painful aspect of the experience. These men had fought for years believing in the righteousness of their cause, or at least in the necessity of defending their homeland. They had watched comrades die. They had endured cold, hunger, fear. They had committed themselves fully to the war effort. And now, standing in an American factory, they realized it had all been for nothing. Germany's leaders had sent them to fight an enemy they could never defeat, based on lies and delusions. Some prisoners redirected their anger toward Hitler and the Nazi leadership. Others sank into depression. A few clung desperately to the belief that Germany possessed secret weapons, the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, the mythical Wunderwaffen, that would turn the tide. But even these last hopes faded as they calculated the numbers. Even if Germany's experimental weapons worked perfectly, even if every V-2 hit its target and every Me-262 shot down 10 Allied planes, it would not matter. The Americans would keep coming. The factories would keep running. The industrial machine would grind on until Germany was crushed. The climax of this psychological campaign came in specific documented moments that revealed the depth of the prisoners' despair. At Willow Run, a group of Luftwaffe officers was given a tour of the B-24 assembly line. These were men who had flown against American bombers, who had watched formations of liberators darken the sky over Germany. They knew the B-24 well, its strengths, its weaknesses, the best angles of attack, but they had never considered where these planes came from or how many were being built. As they walked the length of the assembly line, an American officer explained the production process. Workers installed sections of fuselage, riveters sealed joints, electrical systems were threaded through the airframe, wings were attached, engines were mounted. At the far end, a completed bomber sat on the tarmac, its silver skin gleaming, ready for a test flight. The entire process from raw materials to finished aircraft took hours, not weeks. One of the German officers, a major who had shot down 12 Allied planes, stopped walking. He stood motionless, staring at the assembly line. An American guard asked if he was all right. The major turned, and his eyes were wet. "We are lost. We were always lost. You are building these faster than we can shoot them down." How many factories like this do you have?" When told there were multiple plants producing B-24s, plus factories building B-17s, B-29s, P-51s, and countless other aircraft, he closed his eyes. We never had a chance. Another moment occurred at a shipyard in Baltimore, where German naval officers captured after U-boat sinkings were shown the production of Liberty ships. Germany's U-boat campaign had been brutally effective in 1942, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. The Kriegsmarine believed it could starve Britain and disrupt the Allied supply chain to such an extent that the Allies would be forced to negotiate. But by 1943, the tide had turned. New escort carriers, improved sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, and most importantly, the sheer volume of American shipbuilding had overwhelmed the U-boat threat. The German officers watched as workers assembled a Liberty ship with industrial precision. Prefabricated sections were welded together. Engines were lowered into place by massive cranes. Propellers were attached. Within days, a vessel capable of carrying thousands of tons of cargo would slide down the ways and into the harbor. One Kapitänleutnant, who had commanded a Type 7 U-boat before being captured, did the math in his head. Even if every U-boat in the Atlantic sank one ship per patrol, an impossible rate, the Americans were still building replacements faster than Germany could destroy them. "How do you fight this?" he asked in American translator. In the Kriegsmarine, we celebrated every ship sunk. We painted marks on our conning towers. We thought we were winning. But for every ship we sunk, you built 3 more. We were drowning you in nothing. We were dying for nothing. Interrogators reported similar reactions across multiple camps. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, a group of Waffen-SS officers, men ideologically committed to Nazism, were shown photographs of American production facilities and asked to estimate monthly output. Their guesses were consistently far below reality. When given the actual numbers, several refused to believe them, insisting the figures were propaganda. A week later, they were taken to a nearby factory producing military trucks. They counted the vehicles coming off the line. They timed the production. They saw the warehouses full of completed trucks waiting for transport to ports. Their objections died in their throats. Letters written by prisoners and intercepted by censors revealed the spreading despair. One Feldwebel wrote to a fellow prisoner in another camp, "They brought us to a factory yesterday. I cannot describe what I saw. It was like looking into the mouth of a furnace. Metal, noise, machines, workers everywhere. They are building tanks as if they were bicycles, one after another, endlessly. I thought of our factories in Essen, how we celebrated when production reached 100 tanks per month. Here, they build that many in a week. How did we ever think we could win?" Another letter from an officer to his family in Germany, never delivered but preserved in intelligence archives, read, "I have seen the enemy's homeland. It is untouched. Their cities are whole. Their people are fed. Their factories run day and night without fear of bombs. We were told lies, Mama. Everything we were told was a lie. America is not weak. It is a giant, and we woke it. I do not know when I will come home, but if I do, I will tell everyone the truth. We cannot defeat them. We must stop this war before there is nothing left of Germany." The shift in prisoner morale was measurable and dramatic. Camp commanders reported increased cooperation with Allied intelligence. Prisoners who had previously refused to answer questions beyond name, rank, and serial number began volunteering information about German defensive positions, troop strengths, and morale. Some justified this cooperation by arguing that the war was already lost and further resistance would only prolong suffering. Others seemed driven by anger at their own leaders for lying to them. One intelligence officer at Fort Meade described the change. Before the factory tours, these men were prisoners in body only. Their spirits remained in Germany, loyal to the Führer, confident in ultimate victory. After the tours, something broke. They stopped singing Nazi songs. They stopped giving the Hitler salute. They began asking questions about America, about democracy, about what would happen after the war. They had seen the future, and it did not include a German victory. The realization that spread through the camps was simple and devastating. We cannot win this war. We never could. Everything we fought for, everything we sacrificed, was based on a lie. And now we sit in American camps, well-fed and safe, while our comrades die in a war that was lost before it began. The knowledge carried by these prisoners began to ripple outward, affecting not just the men in American camps, but the broader German war effort. Through Red Cross mail, through prisoner exchanges, through the return of wounded or ill prisoners under Geneva Convention provisions, word began to filter back to Germany. Soldiers on the Eastern Front heard from repatriated comrades about American factories. U-boat crews learned that their sacrifices were meaningless against American shipbuilding capacity. Luftwaffe pilots realized that shooting down bombers was futile when new ones appeared endlessly. German military intelligence intercepted some of these communications and recognized the problem. Reports circulated among Wehrmacht staff officers describing a collapse in morale among troops who had heard about American industrial capacity. Some generals argued for increased propaganda efforts to counter these claims, but the propaganda was losing its effectiveness. Soldiers who had fought on the Western Front after D-Day had seen American equipment firsthand. They had watched American artillery saturate German positions with shells. They had been bombed by waves of American aircraft. They had faced American tanks that, while individually inferior to German Panthers and Tigers, appeared in such overwhelming numbers that German armor could not stop them. By late 1944, Wehrmacht units in the West were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Some of this reflected exhaustion and supply shortages, but intelligence reports also noted a psychological shift. German soldiers increasingly believed the war was unwinnable. Officers who once maintained strict discipline found their troops unwilling to die for a lost cause. Entire units walked out of their positions and surrendered to advancing American forces rather than face annihilation in pointless last stands. The collapse of morale extended to the officer corps. High-ranking prisoners held in separate facilities engaged in long discussions about what had gone wrong. Some blamed Hitler's strategic blunders, the decision to invade the Soviet Union, the declaration of war on the United States, the failure to destroy the RAF in 1940. Others pointed to intelligence failures, the underestimation of enemy capabilities, the over-reliance on propaganda instead of objective analysis. One general major, captured in France and held at a camp for senior officers, told an American interrogator, "We studied Napoleon's campaigns in military school. We learned that even the greatest general cannot overcome impossible logistics. Napoleon had to feed his army from the land. When Russia's vastness swallowed his supply lines, he was finished. We should have learned that lesson. Instead, we attacked enemies whose industrial capacity we did not understand. America was never going to run out of tanks, planes, or ships. We were finished the moment Roosevelt signed the declaration of war." POW cooperation with Allied intelligence reached levels that shocked American officers. Prisoners provided detailed information about German defensive fortifications along the Rhine. They drew maps of minefields and bunker systems. They identified which units were battle-hardened and which were composed of old men and boys pressed into service. Some prisoners even volunteered to participate in propaganda broadcasts aimed at German troops, urging them to surrender.
This cooperation was not universal.
Die-hard Nazis, especially within the SS, remained committed to the cause. They organized resistance cells within the camps, attacking prisoners they deemed traitors. American guards had to segregate the camps, keeping ideological fanatics separate from those who had abandoned hope of German victory. But the trend was clear. The factory tours and the broader exposure to American industrial power had broken the Wehrmacht's psychological cohesion. The final reckoning came in numbers that were almost incomprehensible. By the end of World War II, the United States had produced military equipment on a scale never before seen in human history. The statistics were staggering, and for the German prisoners who learned them, utterly crushing. Aircraft production, 297,000 military planes. This included 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses, 18,482 B-24 Liberators, 15,596 P-51 Mustangs, and thousands of other types. Germany, fighting for its survival and mobilizing every resource, produced approximately 120,000 aircraft. The ratio was nearly 3-to-1 in America's favor, and every American plane was built in a factory that had never been bombed. Tank and armored vehicle production. The United States manufactured 88,410 tanks during the war, predominantly M4 Shermans. When other armored vehicles, tank destroyers, armored cars, half-tracks were included, the number exceeded 150,000. Germany produced roughly 25,000 tanks and 12,000 other armored vehicles. Again, the American advantage was overwhelming, and American tanks were mechanically reliable, easy to repair, and supported by a logistical system that kept them fueled and armed. Naval production. The United States launched 141 aircraft carriers of all types, including fleet carriers, escort carriers, and light carriers. Germany completed 0 carriers. The U.S. built 349 destroyers, 498 destroyer escorts, 203 submarines, and over 2,700 Liberty ships. The Kriegsmarine, once a proud force, was reduced to U-boats hiding in the Atlantic and surface ships trapped in port by Allied air superiority. Ammunition. American factories produced 44 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, 41 billion rounds of artillery ammunition, and millions of bombs. German troops often fought with rationed ammunition, while American soldiers could fire at will. Vehicles. Beyond tanks, the United States produced 2.4 million military trucks, including the legendary GMC CCKW Deuce-and-a-Half and the Dodge WC series. These trucks moved supplies, towed artillery, carried troops, and kept Allied armies mobile. Germany, by contrast, relied heavily on horses for transport well into the final years of the war. German prisoners confronted with these numbers understood what they meant. It was not that German soldiers lacked courage or that German engineers lacked skill. It was that Germany had challenged an enemy whose industrial capacity rendered courage and skill irrelevant. No amount of fighting spirit could overcome a tenfold disadvantage in production. No tactical brilliance could compensate for being outnumbered, outgunned, and outsupplied at every turn. In the post-war years, as Germany lay in ruins and millions of prisoners slowly returned home, many carried with them the memory of American factories. They told their families, their friends, their neighbors, they wrote memoirs, they gave interviews. A common theme emerged in these accounts. We were lied to. We were sent to fight a war we could never win, against an enemy we did not understand. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1960s, summarized the experience. When I was captured, I still believed Germany would find a way to win. I had faith in the Führer, in our generals, in our technology. Then they took me to America. They showed me their factories. They showed me their cities, their farms, their roads, and I understood. We were ants attacking an elephant. The elephant did not even notice us at first, but when it did, when America turned its full strength toward us, we were crushed. Not because we lacked bravery, but because we lacked everything else. And our leaders knew this. They sent us to die anyway. The legacy of this industrial supremacy reshaped modern warfare. Future conflicts would be decided not just by the skill of soldiers or the genius of generals, but by the capacity to produce, supply, and sustain military forces. The Soviet Union learned this lesson and transformed itself into an industrial superpower. China, decades later, would pursue the same path. The wars of the 20th and 21st centuries became in many ways contests of industrial capacity as much as military strategy. For the German prisoners who wept in American factories, the lesson was personal and painful. They had believed in something, whether it was Nazi socialism, German cultural superiority, or simply the righteousness of defending their homeland. That belief had been shattered by the cold reality of production lines, assembly plants, and untouched cities stretching to the horizon. The story of German POWs confronting American industrial power is not a tale of heroes and villains. It's a story about the gulf between propaganda and reality, about the human cost of ideological blindness, and about the overwhelming force of industrial modernity applied to the machinery of war. These men were not monsters, though some had participated in monstrous acts. They were soldiers, caught in a conflict shaped by forces beyond their understanding, fed lies by leaders who cared nothing for their lives. When the truth was finally revealed, not through argument or debate, but through the undeniable evidence of their own eyes, many broke under the weight of that knowledge. They wept not just for themselves, but for their comrades still fighting, for their families enduring bombing raids, for a nation that had been led into catastrophe by men who mistook myth for reality. The factories that broke them were not just symbols of American power. They were monuments to a different kind of society, one that could mobilize its people, organize its resources, and focus its energy on a common goal without the need for totalitarian control. American workers built those planes and tanks not because a dictator commanded them, but because they believed in the cause. Democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, had proven capable of outproducing tyranny. History remembers the battles, Normandy, the Bulge, the drive to the Rhine. But wars are not won solely on battlefields. They are won in factories, shipyards, and mines. They are won by workers who never fire a shot, but who build the weapons that make victory possible. The German prisoners who stood in those American factories learned this lesson in the most visceral way imaginable. They saw the future of warfare, and they terrified them, because they understood, finally and irrevocably, that their war had been lost long before the first shot was fired. It was lost the moment Germany chose to fight an enemy whose industrial might could not be matched, whose homeland could not be touched, and whose people would not quit until victory was won. That realization, more than any bullet or bomb, broke the Wehrmacht's will to fight. And in the tears of those prisoners, in their silent acceptance of inevitable defeat, the war's true outcome became clear. Not a triumph of good over evil, though that narrative would dominate post-war memory, but a demonstration of industrial power so overwhelming that resistance became not just futile, but unthinkable. The factories spoke, and their message was absolute.